In the heart of the Australian desert, under a silent and unforgiving sky, a tragedy unfolded. A devastated family, a missing baby, and an entire society ready to judge before even understanding. What really happened that night at Uluru? Did nature speak, and people refused to listen? Today you will learn about the disappearance that divided a nation, and one family's brutal fight for the truth. It was the night of August 17th, 1980, and the Australian desert lay beneath a silently starry sky. Claire and Daniel Harrington, accompanied by their two young children and newborn Emily, had taken advantage of the holiday to explore Uluru National Park. The scenery seemed untouched by time. The sacred red stone monolith dominated the landscape, while the small family camp was lost in the golden expanse around it. Amidst the heat that still emanated from the ground and the smell of dry land, the family had a relaxed dinner around the fire without knowing that that night would change their lives irreversibly. As the hours passed, Claire picked up little Emily, just 9 weeks old, and carefully placed her to sleep inside the tent. She tenderly adjusted the blanket and zipped up the entrance to protect her from the desert cold, which intensified as the sky darkened. The environment remained peaceful, interrupted only by the crackle of burning wood and the murmur of conversations from the few campers. However, in the deepening darkness, something was moving stealthily. Not long after, Claire caught a subtle sound. A scratching noise, something different coming from the direction of the tent. A shiver ran through his body. Instinctively, Claire ran to the tent. When she opened the entrance, she was greeted by a scene of pure terror. The tarp was torn, as if it had been violently opened, and Emily was gone. The makeshift crib was empty. The blanket was untidy. The shock was so intense that for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, driven by despair, Claire let out a scream that cut the night in two. "A dingo took my baby." The sound echoed across the silent expanse, reaching the other campers who, within seconds, abandoned what they were doing and ran towards him. The camp descended into frantic chaos. Daniel tried to coordinate the search groups. Flashlights flickered among the dry bushes, and voices full of anguish called for the lost baby. A trail of footprints, possibly those of a dingo, was detected near the tent, but the treacherous outback sands erased the tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Local authorities were called, but the merciless vastness seemed to conspire against any hope. Between the rush and growing tension, an even darker shadow began to form. Suspicion, invisible, but already threatening, against the Harrington family itself. In the first days after Emily's disappearance, the Harrington family's despair still echoed in the news. The headlines initially showed empathy. "Tragedy in the heart of Australia," they said. However, as time passed without the baby being found, the narrative changed subtly. And then, violently, the public began to wonder, was it possible that a dingo had actually taken a human child? Although dingoes were known in the region, few wanted to believe such a brutal attack could happen. Popular incredulity, fueled by wild speculation, quickly replaced compassion. Without realizing it, Australia was starting to turn Claire and Daniel from victims into suspects. Claire's every gesture was scrutinized coldly. His restrained way of expressing grief, something natural for his reserved personality, was interpreted as coldness, or worse, as indifference. "No mother would act like that," said radio commentators and outraged neighbors. The Harringtons' Adventist religion, until then an irrelevant detail, began to be highlighted in tones of suspicion. Absurd suspicions arose, rumors of rituals, conspiracies, bizarre stories without any real basis. The media, hungry for an Audience took advantage of this new version of events, creating increasingly sensationalist headlines that slowly undermined the family's credibility before the entire country. Meanwhile, the police, pressured by public opinion and the lack of results, began to reorient the investigation. What once seemed like a search for the truth now seemed like a race to find someone to blame. They questioned the camp's logistics, examined the Harringtons' belongings with a magnifying glass, and looked for inconsistencies in the statements. Small details, normal in any traumatic account, were treated as fatal contradictions. Before long, investigators were already talking openly among themselves about the hypothesis that Claire had murdered her daughter. The possibility of an animal attack previously considered began to be discarded as unlikely and unlikely. In the midst of all this, Claire and Daniel found themselves increasingly isolated. Friends moved away. The local Adventist church was divided between supporting them and keeping their distance, fearing association with the controversy. Over time, the couple realized that they were not just fighting to find Emily or prove that they were telling the truth. They were fighting to survive a moral lynching that was growing day by day. At that moment, perhaps not even they imagined how cruel and devastating the upcoming battle would be. A battle that would leave scars that neither time nor future justice would be able to erase. 2 years after Emily's disappearance, the Harrington family tragedy has become a national spectacle. In 1982, Claire was formally accused of murder, and Daniel of being an accomplice in the alleged cover-up of the crime. The trial, held in Darwin, did not seem like a process of searching for the truth. It seemed like theater designed to satisfy an audience hungry for blood. From the beginning, the prosecution relied more on emotional innuendo than on solid evidence. Experts claimed to have found blood residue in the Harringtons' car, even though there was no reliable technology at the time to guarantee this identification. Emily's torn clothes, key pieces of the disappearance, were treated as evidence of staging. Claire, pregnant with the couple's 4th child, faced the court with dignity, but her reserved stance was constantly exploited as an argument against her. Media psychologists speculated about his emotional coldness, as if there were a standard way of showing pain. Meanwhile, Daniel was portrayed as the submissive husband, silent accomplice to a heinous crime. Every day, the couple saw their private lives mercilessly dissected. The hearings became a showcase for prejudice, ignorance, and a thirst for public punishment. Few seemed concerned about the most important question: where was the real evidence? The defense was fighting an avalanche of prejudgments. Witnesses who could support the dingo attack thesis were ignored or discredited. Animal behavior. Experts who warned of the possibility of an attack like that had their testimonies disregarded. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. No matter what was said, it seemed like Claire's fate was already sealed. In October 1982, the verdict was announced. Claire Harrington was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Daniel was convicted of being an accessory after the fact, receiving a suspended sentence. As she was led away in handcuffs, Claire held her head high, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the injustice she was carrying. She gave birth to her 4th child, a boy named Noah, while imprisoned. The world outside the prison continued, oblivious to the irreparable pain the Harringtons faced. Time, however, was beginning to work silently against the constructed lie. Ignored clues, questionable reports, and the absence of any real proof would begin, little by little, to undermine the castle of accusations that seemed unshakable. The truth, buried beneath layers of prejudice and collective blindness, still breathed, weak but alive, under the red sands of the desert. 4 years after Claire's conviction, fate, or perhaps the insistent truth, decided to manifest itself in an unexpected way. In 1986, as search teams searched for a lost tourist near Uluru, a discovery changed everything. In the undergrowth close to a dingo den, a police officer found a piece of clothing buried in the sand. A baby jacket, small, worn out by time, but still recognizable. When the item was recovered and identified, it became clear it was the jacket that Claire had repeatedly described as being worn by Emily on the night of her disappearance. A jacket that until that moment, many swore never existed. The discovery came as a shock to all of Australia. The jacket was the material evidence needed to prove that Emily had, in fact, been the victim of an animal attack, exactly as Claire had reported from the beginning. Forensic experts confirmed that the marks on the piece were consistent with dingo bites. Public pressure, which had previously demanded conviction, now demanded answers. How could the judicial system ignore so much evidence? How could an innocent mother be torn from her children based on flimsy theories and cultural prejudices? Trust in institutions began to crumble, and the truth, stifled for so long, finally began to emerge. Faced with the new evidence, Claire was immediately released from prison. The government began a review of the case, and in 1988, Claire and Daniel Harrington were officially acquitted of all charges. The court ruling declared what Claire had always known in her heart: she was innocent. But the damage was already done. Years of public humiliation, family separation, and irreparable suffering had left deep scars on the Harringtons' lives. The country watched, now in shame, as Claire tried to rebuild the shattered pieces of her existence. His return to freedom was not a triumphant victory. It was the slow, painful attempt to survive the devastation caused not just by a tragedy, but by a monumental injustice. Even with the acquittal, full recognition of the truth would still take some time to arrive. In 2012, after a new official investigation, the Australian court finally concluded Emily Harrington was killed by a dingo attack. There was no longer room for doubts or alternative theories. More than 30 years after the fateful night in the desert, Claire and Daniel's story of pain, loss and resistance has finally been officially set straight. But for the Harrington family, no sentence, no reparation would be able to return what was taken from them. Their daughter, their dignity, the lost years. Some scars, like the Uluru desert, are eternal. 4 years had passed since Claire Harrington was led away in handcuffs before cameras and crowds thirsting for justice. Life went on for many, but for Claire and Daniel, time seemed frozen on the night they lost Emily. In 1986, during the search for a missing tourist near Uluru, the unlikely happened. Amidst the twisted vegetation, near an old dingo den, a piece of children's clothing was found half buried in the red sand. It was small, clear, still intact despite the years. When examined, it was confirmed. It was the jacket that Claire had desperately described the night of her disappearance. The jacket that many claimed never existed. The discovery fell like a bomb on Australian society. The piece was the physical evidence that supported the story Claire told from the beginning. Emily had been attacked by a dingo. Experts analyzed the jacket and confirmed marks compatible with bites from a wild animal. Suddenly, the entire narrative built against the Harrington family collapsed like a house of cards. The same press that had previously judged and publicly condemned them now printed terms such as judicial error and national tragedy on their covers. But for Claire and Daniel, the revelation had a bitter taste. The truth might finally emerge, but the price paid for it was incalculable. Faced with the new evidence, the government reopened the case. Within a few weeks, Claire was released from prison where she had spent years deprived of her children and her own dignity. In 1988, after a formal investigation, Claire and Daniel Harrington were officially acquitted of all charges. Justice, although late, recognized that Emily's death was caused by a dingo attack, exactly as Claire had tried to explain to the world from the beginning. Even so, the release and absolution brought no celebration. They brought silence, sadness, and the bitter realization that nothing, absolutely nothing, could repair what had been destroyed. For years, Claire avoided the media spotlight, focusing only on rebuilding what she could of her broken life. However, pain was a constant visitor. In 2012, more than 3 decades after the tragedy, Australia held a new hearing, this time definitive. In official minutes, it was declared that Emily Harrington had died as a result of a dingo attack. The truth, finally, was recognized without dispute. But for Claire, Daniel, and their children, this belated recognition was like a distant echo, an apology that didn't erase the scars, nor give back the years lost to the injustice that once stifled their lives. Even after the acquittal and official recognition of the truth, the marks that injustice had left on the Harringtons' lives were deep and irreversible. Claire and Daniel left the concrete prison, but they would never escape the invisible prison that the memory of the tragedy imposed on them. The world around, although now more compassionate, did not erase the suspicious looks, the whispers on the corners, the weight of a pain that would never end. Claire, especially, felt that she was carrying 2 losses, that of her daughter and that of the woman she had once been, light, cheerful, confident. In its place, there remained a shadow of herself, shaped by injustice and longing that no absolution would be able to console. Claire and Daniel's relationship also changed. There was no physical separation, but between them there was now a silent distance, made up of everything they could not repair. The nights were long and empty, full of memories that they both avoided naming. They tried to be strong for their children, who also carried the scars of their family's history, even without fully understanding its contours. Noah, the son Claire, gave birth to in prison, grew up hearing echoes of a past she never lived, but that would shape her identity forever. The Harrington family tried to rebuild itself amidst the fragments, like someone putting together a broken mirror, aware that the reflection will never be the same. The media, which had once destroyed them, was now trying to redeem itself through emotional reports and belated apologies. But to Claire, the words sounded empty. Every camera flash was a reminder of how they had been, exposed, tried and condemned without real defense. Public opinion, so quick to turn its back, seemed to want to forget the past. But Claire knew that forgetting was a privilege she would never have. Emily lived in her, not as a sweet memory, but as a glaring absence, a promise of life cut short the moment a dingo crossed the desert darkness. The longing was fierce, as wild as the animal that had taken her. Still, Claire found the strength to continue. Over time, he dedicated himself to working on social justice causes, using his own story to shine a light on miscarriages of justice and fight for forgotten victims. He became a respected voice, even if filled with sadness. His courage was silent, almost painful to watch. Daniel, in turn, dedicated himself to his family, trying to offer his children as normal a childhood as possible within what was left. Together, Claire and Daniel learned that some losses cannot be overcome. They can only be learned to deal with. And that, amidst the ruins, it is still possible to find dignity even when happiness seems forever distant. Decades have passed, but for Claire and Daniel Harrington, time has never managed to erase the contours of that fateful night under the skies of Uluru. The loss of Emily, the unjust imprisonment, the public humiliation, it all remained alive, lodged in the folds of memory. Each anniversary of their daughter's birth, each silent night, brought with it a shadow that never stopped hovering over their lives. For the world, The Harrington case had become part of history, a painful footnote in the record of Australian justice. But for Claire and Daniel, it was an open wound, invisible to the eyes of those on the outside who believed that delayed justice was enough to end the pain. Emily Harrington's name began to appear in law books, journalism classes, and debates on judicial responsibility. The dingo attack, once treated as improbable, became a brutal example of how human arrogance in the face of nature and truth can cost lives, not just the lives of those lost, but also the lives of those who remain. In many academic circles, the Harrington case has become synonymous with miscarriage of justice, a grim reminder of how prejudice can cloud reason. Still, for Claire, reducing her story to a theoretical lesson was like dehumanizing Emily's memory once again. Despite all the pain, Claire found purpose in sharing her journey. In discreet talks and meetings with families who also faced injustice, she carried a difficult but necessary message. The truth doesn't always scream, often it whispers, and it takes courage to listen to it. Daniel, although less visible, supported every step, every word. Together, even if staggering, they decided not to allow the tragedy to define only destruction in their stories. They preferred to transform pain into awareness, even though this awareness was accompanied by a weight that no one but them could truly understand. Today, looking back, Claire and Daniel know that some ghosts will never be exorcised. Emily continues to live in her dreams, in her silences, and most importantly, in her fight for justice. In every child saved from a miscarriage of justice, in every family protected from the weight of injustice, a small piece of Emily's memory remains alive. And so, even in the deepest shadows of the past, the Harrington story proves that while pain may never disappear, human resilience has the power to transform suffering into legacy, a legacy that no tragedy can erase. After everything you've experienced, do you believe justice was served, or are some scars simply impossible to heal? Comment your opinion below. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with those who need to understand the weight of injustice.